Hi, Joe.
Hello, Tilman. How are you?
Well, as well as one can be in these very troubled times,
I know, grim, but you're still
yeah,
smiling.
awful, awful. How are you?
I'm well. As well as can be. Same
Yeah,
situation,
yeah.
grim every morning, but as you catch up with the latest. But
Oh,
anyhow, we're here.
we're here still,
Mm.
yes.
Now, uh, Tilman, you and I have been at the issues of mutual interest, which is the nuclear danger, for a long time. How do you read what is happening at the moment, especially in the light of the latest development, namely Trump's decision to bomb nuclear sites in Iran?
Well, we're already in a really severe predicament with it widely assessed that the dangers of nuclear weapons use are greater than they've ever been, at least as great as they have ever been, and possibly greater than in the past and growing. And I think, unfortunately, this recent development of the US attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, I think, just accentuates that danger. There are many questions about this, of course. It strikes me as an illegal and unwarranted attack, an aggressive act that's way beyond the UN Charter. For large states with large nuclear arsenals that have completely ignored their obligation, binding legal obligations for more than half a century to disarm, who have failed to honour those, to now claim any right to conduct selective non-proliferation by unilateral military attack is an appalling example of just an exercise of raw might and the law of the jungle, and is likely to set back non-proliferation efforts and the fragmented and imperfect regime we already have further, risking both increased Iranian determination to be close to a nuclear weapon or actually build them, and also the message it sends for the lack of respect for international law and agreements by the largest and most powerful states that dramatically undermines international law and disarmament and arms control agreements more broadly. Of course, it also poses profound risks of escalation and that could embroil other states in the region, other powers, and risk nuclear weapons use. We've already had two active, ongoing hot wars in Ukraine and Palestine, Israel, involving nuclear armed states, both associated with threats of nuclear weapons use in those conflicts. Um, there are also significant environmental risks associated with bombing nuclear facilities. There are very hazardous, long-lived chemical and radioactive materials in those facilities, and bombing them indiscriminately at a very large scale with the world's largest conventional weapons does pose significant long-term health and environmental risks as well of dispersal or of radioactive material. Happily, thus far, speaking on the 23rd of June, as yet there haven't been reports of increases in off-site radioactivity of any of the targeted facilities, but that doesn't exclude what further attacks might do. Incomplete information, which I suspect we have at present, or leaks that may only become evident longer term, particularly into groundwater and local environments rather than into the atmosphere. Um, so I think from any perspective, this is an alarming escalation. Now we also hear that in addition to the supposed target of this being a war with Iran's nuclear program and not Iran per se or the regime on the part of the American administration, we're now hearing talk from the president of the desirability of regime change. And of course, this is a slippery slope of intervention. There's not a very encouraging history of short and surgical or contained military engagements by external powers in the Middle East. Long involvements with negative repercussions, of course, most particularly for civilians in the region, that persist over decades. And of course, it's civilians that always suffer the most in these circumstances. My Iranian friends are terrified and frightened and having great difficulty contacting relatives. Many people have already fled Tehran if they were able to do so, but then, where is safe in a country of 90 million people, with its defenses having been significantly weakened, and as President Trump boasted, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has also boasted, they have essentially access and control of Iranian airspace. So we're really at the mercy, and Iranians are at the mercy of what limits Israel and the United States might impose on their militaries, rather than any defensive capacities in Iran, where also public communications means via both internet and broadcast media have been damaged, so that people's access to where they can go to, where might be safe, what to do is also limited. It's an awful situation. I can see long-term very little good coming out of this. I was frankly appalled by the statements of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister this morning in Australia, essentially supporting these measures, as Australia has a long history of supporting whatever illegal and aggressive actions supposed great and powerful friends that we need to ingratiate ourselves to conduct. But I was particularly concerned about this intervention being supported. The Foreign Minister's statement said essentially that we support any measures that constrain Iran's capacity to obtain a nuclear weapon. This is really an admission that Australia's support for international law and consistent standards is very one-sided and rings, frankly, rather hollow.
And one might ask why an Iranian nuclear weapon being the cause of such concern and not an Israeli nuclear weapon.
Of course. I mean, that's the fundamental problem here, is this, as the South African government and its diplomats often refer to, this system of nuclear apartheid that we have, essentially, where some states, 9 of them, claim some unique right to possess these weapons that jeopardize all of us and the healthy biosphere every single day that exists, that pose an absolutely existential threat to everything alive on this good earth. Some nations reserve the right to hold us all in that jeopardy, while so vociferously and aggressively denying that right to self-selected others on a very selective and changing basis that has no moral or legal standing and is completely unsustainable in the long term, because of course any country that can enrich uranium or that has either research or nuclear power reactors that generate plutonium in the spent fuel from the uranium fuel for the reactors has the means to produce nuclear weapons if it's determined to do so, and particularly the fissile material that Iran has now in 400 kilograms of 60% enriched, highly enriched uranium. Building a bomb out of highly enriched uranium is very simple. It's something that any master's or PhD level engineering or physics student should be able to demonstrate the capacity to do within a matter of weeks using publicly available information. So that cat is out of the bag. So we can't constrain access to nuclear weapons by restricting access to the means to produce them. We need an international cooperative system that provides an equitable regime for all nations. There are not good nuclear weapons and bad nuclear weapons, or responsible states to be entrusted with nuclear weapons and ones for whom the potential prospect of them obtaining nuclear weapons, even that don't yet exist in the case of Iran or previously in the case of Iraq, would justify an invasion. You know, that sort of double standard is simply unsustainable. And that, plus the failure of the 9 nuclear armed states to fulfill their long-standing obligations to disarm, is the principal driver of proliferation.
What would you like to see in the short term by way of what's been happening in the Israel-Iran conflict and now involving the US? Are there any short-term steps that you think would at least reduce the dangers, and then we can talk about longer-term ways forward?
Well, in the short term, of course, the critical needs are that the fighting stop, the escalating spiral stop, and that the negotiated settlement that will eventually be required be initiated through some kind of UN-mediated or regional process. I mean, Iran and Egypt in 1984 made the first serious proposal for a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And despite being boycotted by Israel and the United States, the regular annual conferences, there's another one coming up this November, of the regional states, pursuant to the UN resolutions about a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, have reached a remarkable degree of agreement amongst all of the 20 plus other states of the region. So this provides one,
minus Israel.
Minus Israel and the United States, yes, it also has boycotted that conference, but all the Arab states essentially have agreed. So I think that's one pretty useful place to start. But of course, in the short term, an end to the wars. I mean, Israel's prosecuting wars in essentially every possible direction. Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. You know, this needs to stop. And crucially, those aiding and abetting Israel's really aggressive and one would have to say genocidal war in Gaza. It's only possible for Israel to do that with the political, financial, and military support and weapons supplies from other states, notably the United States, but also others, crucially Germany and Australia playing a not insignificant role here. Important parts for the munitions releasing mechanisms in the F-35 advanced fighter strike aircraft that the Israeli Air Force is using. Those parts are made in Melbourne and in Brisbane. Australia, at the very least, should say that we will not participate in any request for support in military operations in the Middle East. We should immediately enact a two-way end to arms trade with Israel. We should make it clear to the United States that any long-range platform involved in military attacks in the Middle East is not permitted to transit in or refuel in Australia, as B-2 stealth bombers that were involved in these most recent bombings transited and refueled in Australian airspace late last year on their route to bomb targets in Yemen. Australia needs to put a stop to that. So there are certainly measures that other states, as well as, of course, those in the region, can take to really try and end this conflict as quickly as possible. Any routes for mediation that are open between Iran, Israel, and the United States, current or as yet undeveloped, should be explored.
Tilman, what do you've mentioned a number of things that a country like Australia, and that would apply to some other allies of the United States, could do that would be moving in a more positive direction. What do you think stops that happening? Thinking specifically Australia, if you like, but
look,
what's stopping the Albanese government doing these things at the moment?
Well, I think I don't have a direct answer from them, but for example, on another matter, not unrelated, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which
I was going to ask you about that.
Which yes. Australia has joined every other applicable global and regional nuclear arms control and disarmament instrument. And we have also joined every other applicable treaty that prohibits and provides for the elimination of an inhumane and indiscriminate weapon, cluster munitions, landmines, biological, chemical weapons, even where our position differed from that of the United States, which, for example, hasn't signed the cluster munitions and landmines ban. We properly and courageously got on the right side of history for those. Labor has affirmed since its national conference in 2018 at two subsequent national conferences. Now an enduring part of its national policy platform is to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It hasn't yet done so. Of course, it needs to do so as a matter of urgency, as by far the most effective step that Australia can take to try and strengthen the disarmament regime and get disarmament moving from forwards instead of backwards. The very clear reason why Australia hasn't done that is simply because of US displeasure if we did so. And one suspects now, with the concern about the erratic and nationalist, inward-looking, self-interested nature of the Trump administration, the capricious and erratic decision-making, the lack of consistency, and the threat of sanction tariffs. Australia's, and now both the US and UK, having initiated, very appropriately, if belatedly, a review of the AUKUS agreement, Australia being the only one of the partners that hasn't yet done so, that there would be concern in Canberra about the horse trading, frankly, going on or needing to be done to not upset, a very irascible president who has a very vindictive nature and a very personal, ego-based way of assessing loyalty and character of people and nations. And Australia may be trying to ingratiate itself in some way by supporting this attack in order to win some trade or AUKUS or other advantage. I think that fundamentally, that sort of transactional politics is really inappropriate and really demeaning at such a critical global juncture of such profound risk, where international law and cooperation are under such profound threat. But I can only speculate.
Well, I know that ICANN has been the prime mover for the treaty to which you referred on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and you've mentioned how Labor has, by its federal conferences, been committed to signing up to the treaty. Has ICANN ever received any explanation as to why it has not up to date?
No, the only explanation we have received is the one I refer to, that essentially it would not please the United States for Australia to do so.
That's an admission that we only act in ways that would please the United States.
Well, that would be the implication, or that yes, it was not. It certainly hasn't excluded Australia from taking bold initiatives, at other historical periods. And I mentioned
Of
the
course.
landmines and cluster munitions bans, and God bless him, Malcolm Fraser, and in decades past, being the first US allied leader to actually essentially renege against the neither confirm nor deny policy of regarding nuclear capable platforms, ships and aircraft and submarines, and exclude nuclear capable and nuclear armed ships and aircraft from Australia, and that was done with no major repercussions. Australia has done brave things before.
Yes.
Australia, so it's time we did it again, and it's
Mm,
particularly, I think, concerning when the evidence is already clear that other US allies have joined the nuclear weapons ban treaty, and enjoyed ongoing and in some cases escalating military cooperation with the United States because it has only been conventional. I refer to
mm,
New Zealand, the Philippines, and Thailand.
mm.
So it's clearly possible, to do this,
Yes.
to have an ongoing alliance relationship with the United States, provided it doesn't involve nuclear weapons activities, and still be a compliant member of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. The problem is that Australia is not neutral in this, that we are essentially part of the problem, that we provide both justification for possession and potential use of nuclear weapons through claiming in consistent white papers and defence policy documents under governments, both Labor and coalition, that US nuclear weapons are the fundamental guarantor of Australia's security, i.e., we might need the US to use them on our behalf on occasion, radioactively incinerate millions of innocent civilians somewhere on
Mm,
our behalf.
mm.
And further, we provide assistance for their possible use, historically through command and control and intelligence support through facilities like Pine Gap and Northwest Cape, but increasingly in recent years through logistical support as well, through the imminent, essentially, basing of US and UK nuclear attack submarines, nuclear powered attack submarines in Australia, not yet nuclear armed, but the Trump administration has plans to change that. The expansion of the Tyndall air base in the Northern Territory to host B-52 bombers on permanent rotation, that essentially amounts to basing, with the construction of dedicated substantial facilities, hangars, aprons, fuel and
Mm.
ammunition storage, logistical support, repair and maintenance facilities. So increasingly, Australia is providing not just command, control, intelligence, communications
Yeah.
support, but also logistical support that could actually see nuclear weapons launched from Australia, with
Yeah.
or without our knowledge or consent. So clearly, there is some work to be done, for Australia to extract itself from those commitments, to be in a position to be able to comply with the obligations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But those are eminently feasible. And I think the first step that the government really must take is to sign the treaty and thereby indicate its clear intent, that would then be the basis for proceeding with those negotiations.
Yeah. Now, Tilman, this is my last question. There is a significant gap between what you are proposing, recommending, for countries like Australia, could apply to Germany and other allies of the US, between what is and where we would like things to be. What can the concerned citizen, either individually or in groups, do that could help bridge that gap?
Yes, there is a vast gap. Look, I think it's clear for nuclear weapons, in particular, and of course in other areas, but I'll focus on that in the detailed historical analysis that Lawrence Whitner, a US historian, who really wrote the definitive 3-volume history of the nuclear disarmament movement, at least up until the 1990s. What clearly fell out for him in terms of analysing what has restrained leaders of nuclear armed states on the many occasions when they have actively considered use of nuclear weapons. The most consistent and dominant factor that emerges is not a legal consideration or a military one. It's the sense of revulsion that they would confront to be the first leader since Hiroshima and Nagasaki to break the nuclear taboo, to use these horrendous global suicide bombs. It's that fear of being forever stigmatized as the worst possible act of any national leader that has restrained people. So that nuclear taboo, that fragile constellation of public concern and pressure and moral argument and scientific evidence and political pressure and law, that has constrained the use of nuclear weapons for the last 80 years, fragile as that taboo is, it's civil society that strengthens that's the key ingredient. And international law by itself is just words on paper unless it's backed up with the pressure and expectation and argument and weight of significant political pressure on governments and individuals who require re-election or who require other kinds of support and reaffirmation. So there's so many good organizations working on these issues. It's not, this is big historic social change that we're seeking. It's not something one does on one's own. Nuclear weapons are also awful and difficult to think about, and it can be rather depressing or and disempowering to think about them without a sense of collective both support and capacity that comes from organizations working persistently and strategically on these issues. There are many successes of the nuclear disarmament movement. I think the end of the first Cold War, many of the disarmament agreements that constrained nuclear weapons types and numbers, that eliminated whole classes of nuclear weapons, the INF Treaty in particular, Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the key protagonists in those developments, said that it was medical and scientific evidence and argument that particularly convinced him. So pressure on leaders, where we don't have enlightened and wise leaders that act on the basis of evidence and think long term, then you need more public pressure than in its absence. But it's an absolutely crucial ingredient, and that's from keeping yourself informed about these issues, using whatever networks and organizations you have, contributing financially, contributing your voice, your vote, your bank accounts and superannuation funds, divesting from institutions that invest in companies that profit from making weapons of mass destruction or other horrible weapons. There's so many ways that people can act. For these big issues of weapons and security policy, it's not like climate action and action on many other important issues where you can act at any level in your own home, your own life. The final common pathway essentially has to be pressure on national governments. But there are many ways to do that. And your elected representatives represent you. They're accountable to you. Go and see them. Knock on their door.
Thanks very much, Tilman, for a wonderful overview, both of the problem and of the need to act collectively and decisively in the light of the looming dangers. I'm sure many on listening to and watching this interview will be encouraged to do exactly that. So thanks again, and we'll see what the next little while brings us.
Thanks very much, Joe.
Thank you.